If you think you're the only person who has rare and complicated problems to the extent that you believe solving them is difficult and impossible, this video will be very beneficial for you. Chapter 3, You Are Not Special, and Chapter 4, The Value of Suffering are explained in this video. Let's enjoy. Manson challenges the idea that everyone is unique and exceptional. He argues that this belief can be harmful and prevent individuals from accepting their flaws and solving their problems. Manson begins by emphasizing that society has cultivated a culture of exceptionalism, where people are constantly told they can be anything they want and achieve great success. However, he argues that this mindset can lead to a sense of entitlement and unrealistic expectations, ultimately resulting in disappointment and dissatisfaction. In this chapter, Mark Manson addresses a topic of utmost importance and one of the most common among us. I'm sure you have people like this in your life, and Mark personifies them in the character of his friend Jimmy. Mark tells a story about a friend named Jimmy, who believed he was important, successful, and knowledgeable about everything in the world. He claimed to have many companies and projects and was confident in himself, considering himself a flawless and perfect person who pursued perfection. However, in reality, Jimmy was a very unsuccessful person who was full of talk and lies. He was deceptive and spent more money on alcohol than on his projects. He deceived and lived off the money of his family, friends, and close acquaintances, deceiving them with his false ideas. Jimmy was a person who talked a lot but did very little. He remained in this state for years until he approached the age of 30. The greatest tragedy was that everything he did, he considered it right, positive, and successful. Despite people mocking him, he had high self-confidence. In his eyes, they were jealous people who hated him and envied his success. People like Jimmy are the ones who need the panda slap that Mark previously mentioned to give them a harsh reality check. Mark suggests that Jimmy may have been influenced by the self-improvement movement that was popular in the 1960s. During that era, it was famous for feeding people with positivity to the extent that they lived in the illusion of success, just like Jimmy believed. Many researchers and policymakers at that time advocated for improving self-esteem because it had tangible social benefits, such as reduced crime rates, improved academic performance, and lower unemployment rates. Therefore, self-esteem became an important concept taught by psychologists, politicians, and educators. Seminars and motivational workshops started singing the anthem, "Each one of us can be exceptional and immensely successful." However, after a generation, it became evident that we are not all exceptional, and merely feeling good about oneself does not mean anything unless there is a valid reason to feel that way. It turned out that hardships and failures are actually useful in shaping a child into a mature, successful, and mentally strong person. Believing that people are exceptional and teaching them that can never produce a society filled with individuals like Bill Gates and Martin Luther King Jr., but it creates a society of people like Jimmy, who indulges in drugs every day and lacks any skills except praising himself and convincing others of what he says. The key, my dear reader, is that the real and accurate measure of self-esteem should also be based on our negative aspects. As Mark says, exceptionality has two extremes. Either you can be extreme in thinking you're exceptional like Jimmy, believing you are above the world and better than everyone else, and denying your problems and negative aspects. This type of exceptionalism prevents you from acknowledging your problems or possibly recognizing and improving the negative aspects within you. As we mentioned in the previous video, problem solving is important. If you see yourself as exceptional, you won't be able to discover your flaws and problems in order to solve them. The other side of exceptionalism is seeing yourself as inferior to the world, the only person with a complicated and difficult life, and the only one whose path to success is not as smooth as others. You believe that others are successful because they don't have the problems you have. If you're one of these people, you're like Jimmy, but the negative version. You need to balance between the two sides. Don't think you're special and exceptional, and don't believe that you're the only one with difficult problems. There may be people who have tougher problems than yours. You must accept your reality, work on improving it, acknowledge your problems, and solve them. If you're not exceptional, you're a normal human being, and know that you won't succeed in every aspect of life. Being an exceptional person is good, and not being exceptional doesn't make you a failure. Beware, my friend, of being like Jimmy, and be cautious not to overlook your problems and deny your negative aspects. It will prevent you from solving them and making progress in life. So, be sure that you're a normal human being and that everyone else has problems like yours or even more. Overall, Chapter 3 challenges the notion of exceptionalism and highlights the importance of embracing one's limitations and focusing on personal growth rather than striving for constant validation and superiority. In this chapter, we will discuss the pleasure of suffering and how we can turn our suffering from painful to pleasurable. I expect that you are currently experiencing suffering in your life. Most of the suffering we go through tends to be painful, but some of it can bring pleasure. Manson explores the idea that suffering is an inherent part of human existence and how embracing it can lead to a more fulfilling life. Manson begins by challenging the notion that we should strive for a life devoid of suffering or pain. He argues that our culture often promotes the idea that happiness should be our primary goal, and any negative emotions or experiences should be avoided at all costs. However, Manson proposes that this mindset is flawed and counterproductive. For example, consider the construction worker who stands under the scorching sun or in the cold all day, yet finds a bright smile and greater happiness compared to an office employee sitting in the shade with air conditioning. Another example is a pregnant woman who endures the extreme hardships of pregnancy. Only a pregnant woman can truly feel the pain of pregnancy. In this chapter, Mark Manson explains suffering based on the story of Japanese Lieutenant Hiro Onoda, an officer in the Japanese Army. The story goes that in 1944, during World War II, orders came from the Japanese Emperor to Lieutenant Onoda and his soldiers to go to the small island of Lubang in the Philippines. The orders commanded them to slow down the advance of the United States forces as much as possible, remain steadfast, fight, and never surrender. The lieutenant knew it was a suicidal mission. In 1945, the American forces reached the island of Lubang and seized it forcefully. Within a few days, most of the Japanese soldiers were killed or surrendered, but Onoda and 3 of his soldiers managed to hide in the jungle. They began waging guerrilla warfare against the American soldiers, attacking supply lines and individual soldiers. After 6 months, America dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, which tragically marked the end of World War II. Strangely, Onoda and his companions were unaware of the war's end and continued launching surprise attacks even on Filipino civilians. They lived a very isolated life, eating insects and animals, stealing crops from the Filipinos, and enduring extreme loneliness. Afterward, the Japanese government collaborated with the United States to drop leaflets announcing the end of the war on all islands and jungles where Japanese soldiers remained fighting after the war's end. Most of the soldiers returned to Japan, except Onoda, who never received the leaflets and believed they were a trick by the Americans to lure out the hidden Japanese soldiers in the jungle. He continued his mission and refused to believe these announcements. 5 years later, the majority of American soldiers returned home, and the inhabitants of Lubang Island tried to return to their normal lives of farming and fishing. However, Hiro Onoda and his men continued to shoot at them, burn their crops, confiscate their livestock, and kill anyone who ventured deep into the jungle, thinking they were American soldiers. In the year 1952, the Japanese government made a final attempt to withdraw the remaining soldiers from their hiding places. This time, photos and messages from the families of these soldiers were dropped by airplanes, along with a message from the Japanese emperor. However, Onoda continued to believe that it was American propaganda. After some time, the inhabitants of the island became hostile and armed themselves to fight Onoda and his comrades. After a while, one of Onoda's companions surrendered and another one was killed. 10 years later, another comrade named Kozuka was killed. Onoda spent the rest of his life hiding in the jungle, alone. There was a young adventurer and explorer named Suzuki who decided to search for Lieutenant Onoda in 1972 after returning to Japan from one of his adventures. He arrived at Lubang Island and started wandering alone, shouting Onoda's name and telling him that the Japanese emperor was worried about him. After 4 days, he managed to find him. This young man asked Lieutenant Onoda why he had stayed on the island all that time, and he answered that he had received orders never to surrender. After approximately 27 years, Onoda returned to Japan after learning that the war had ended. However, upon his return, he was shocked by the changes that had taken place in Japanese society and the loss of the traditions and dreams he once knew. The consumeristic and superficial capitalist culture had overshadowed the values of honor and sacrifice he grew up with. Therefore, be cautious of using incorrect metrics that may destroy your relationships. To choose your true metrics, ask yourself if they are real and accurate measurements. Does the communication between you and your brother really determine the strength of your bond? Mark concludes this chapter by explaining 2 different concepts of value: good value and bad value. Good value is based on constructive social reality and can be adjusted, while bad value is destructive and imaginary, and cannot be adjusted. According to Manson, suffering and pain are unavoidable aspects of life. No matter how successful or wealthy we become, we will inevitably face difficulties and hardships. He suggests that instead of trying to eliminate suffering, we should learn to accept and embrace it. By acknowledging and confronting our own pain, we can develop resilience and grow as individuals. Manson also emphasizes the value of choosing our struggles consciously. He argues that we all have limited time and energy, and it's crucial to direct them towards meaningful and significant endeavors. By choosing our battles wisely and accepting the challenges that align with our values and goals, we can find a sense of purpose and fulfillment. Furthermore, Manson highlights the importance of taking responsibility for our own lives. He encourages readers to stop blaming external factors for their suffering and instead focus on what they can control. By taking ownership of our circumstances and choices, we can empower ourselves to make positive changes and navigate through life's challenges. Ultimately, Manson suggests that embracing suffering can lead to personal growth and a more authentic and satisfying existence. By reframing our perspective on pain and accepting it as an inevitable part of life, we can cultivate resilience, find meaning, and live a life aligned with our true values.